Okay, hi everyone. My name is Michelle Turan and I am a faculty here at Mohawk College. I've been here for about 16 years now. And as well, I'm a research fellow in the College Student Success Innovation Center. But why I'm here today is actually due to my background in training people on intercultural development. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the Intercultural Development Inventory. The inventory is the assessment that you took recently by email. And then we're going to look at how that inventory actually affects you a bit in the workplace. And we'll look specifically at the group results for this class. So we'll see exactly how everyone in this class falls as a group in the Intercultural Development Inventory. So stay with me for the next, we're talking about 30 minutes or so. Try to do your best to stay awake, and I'll share with you some information that might be interesting to you. So let's get started. So our objectives today, essentially, you may have other or different objectives for your use of this tool and learning about this IDI. And they can be completely different than what I'm going to talk about today, but we're going to review the intercultural development and specifically the IDI assessment. We're going to talk specifically about the group results for this class. My apologies, it's not the International Business Environment and Operations class, but that was a class I did previously, but the same idea. Then we're going to talk about possible next steps. And then if you'd like to know your individual results one-on-one, you can email me and I can share them with you, and we can meet if you'd like to meet to discuss. One thing I should mention is that I do have a puppy, so occasionally I just have to correct some puppy behavior, like right now. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. So one of the reasons why the Intercultural Development Inventory is becoming increasingly important for you as an employee in the workforce is there was an extensive survey that was conducted a few years ago by the Institute of the Future. And in their publication that was known as you can see here, Future Work Skills, published in 2011 and repeated in 2020, what they found is that intercultural competence is in fact a core competency of the 21st century. And the IDI, or the Intercultural Development Inventory that you did, is actually going to help you build some additional intercultural competence, if you'd like to. Oops, let me go back here. So what they said in terms of cross-cultural competency, and you'll see these words used interchangeably. So you'll see intercultural competence, you'll see cross-cultural competency. Sometimes you'll hear people talking about cultural humility. It's all essentially the same core concept with some slight variations, in that how do we effectively work with people from different cultures? And what is our ability to do so? How do we communicate? How do we function in those environments? So like I was saying, in this future workforce document, the 10 skills you can see listed here as being really important for the future workforce. And you'll notice specifically in number 4 is this idea of cross-cultural competency. And they define it as the ability to operate in different cultural settings, which in Canada, of course, that becomes really important. So this slide, although it looks a little bit complicated at first, is a really good graph and chart to depict a research study that was conducted in 2000. And this study, which was done by DiStefano and al., just really is showing that how multicultural teams, how they understand, appreciate, and leverage their differences, how that can actually create value and synergy and achieve success beyond levels achieved by what we would call monocultural teams. So in this study, what they're saying is a monocultural team is essentially a team that looks at everyone's culture on the team as being the same, doesn't identify that there are cultural differences necessarily on the team, and it kind of whitewashes everybody and says we're all exactly the same culturally. And this can actually be pretty representative of a traditional workplace organization, specifically, in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So it's only now that we're starting to really embrace this idea of recognizing cultural difference within our workplace. So in this study specifically, what they noticed was that teams that ignored and suppressed cultural difference, they called them destroyers, because what happened is that they actually destroy creative synergy and value, which, if you sort of sit back for a moment and think about that, and when you think about creative minds coming to the table, if creative minds all came to the table with the same viewpoint, with the same way of looking at the world, would we get that sort of synergy or building of new ideas? It's not likely. And what happens when you have this destroyer type teams start to develop some mistrust. Okay, so people start to hold on to information because, there's a lot of competition in that type of environment. You might see jealousy. You might see people attacking other team members because essentially people are trying to make themselves distinguishable. They want to be seen. Okay, so energy that could have been positive actually gets drained into these negative stereotypes. And in this study, what they saw was that team decisions were typically made by the manager or the formal leader without any real genuine discussion among the team members. So the team actually destroyed the value rather than created it. And when we look at, say, this idea of like monocultural teams that, again, like I was saying, those teams that do not leverage differences for innovation, what happens is they equalize differences. Okay. So they suppress them to sort of smooth processes, and in turn, they suppress the differences in ideas and perspectives. Performance becomes really mediocre, and most culturally diverse teams that think of themselves as doing well are really just equalizers. Next, they have the multicultural teams that actually acknowledge and support cultural differences. And they found that they actually performed at really high levels, and they actually exceeded expectations because the differences were really explicitly recognized. They were accepted. They were, in fact, nurtured, and their implications were incorporated into every facet of the group process. So this is what we call the creators. So they create value. And the key here is not like membership. On average, members weren't any better in their individual areas than those in the destroying or equalizing team. The key was about unlocking creative synergy, and this happened with the team's interaction processes, how they in fact leverage those differences for their benefit as a team. So now that brings us to the intercultural development inventory. And here we can see, I'll just pull these up. Here's the descriptors of the tool itself. And what we see here is the IDI actually, well, here's what we know. The IDI has demonstrated value and effective use across cultural communities. I'm going to show you a video in just a second. But essentially, it's a cross-culturally validated assessment of intercultural competence. It's a 50-item questionnaire, as you know by now, that's actually been back translated into 17 languages. So it can be done in a number of folks' first language. And it gets customized to both educational and organizational applications. So you really can use it in a wide variety of environments. But let's just take a look at the video and it'll describe it a little bit better for us. Okay, here we go.
Developing intercultural competence is essential in today's world.
Yet we're not always as culturally proficient as we'd like to be.
Our ability to navigate cultural differences affects what we accomplish in our organizations and what our students learn in our schools. how would you assess the intercultural competence of your group or workplace? The Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI, eliminates the guesswork by identifying the cultural proficiency of not only your group or organization as a whole, but also your leaders and employees. The IDI is the leading tool in corporations, primary and secondary schools, colleges and universities, government, and not-for-profit organizations. The IDI is available in English and many other languages, and is used in over 30 countries across all continents.
The current IDI, developed by Dr. Mitchell Hammer, is a 50-item questionnaire available online and in print. It measures 5 core mindsets and behaviors toward cultural difference that make a difference in how we work, educate, and provide leadership to others. Movement along this continuum towards acceptance and adaptation enhances more culturally responsive teaching for educators, results in managers being more effective mentors and leaders across diverse groups, increases contributions from diverse resources that increase a team's performance, and creates a more diverse and inclusive workplace for an organization or educational institution.
The IDI is used for individual coaching, counseling, and leadership development, and is widely selected for baseline assessments, including needs analysis as well as program evaluation. The IDI has been extensively tested and has high cross-cultural validity and reliability both domestically and internationally. Further, it is not culturally biased and has strong predictability in both educational institutions and organizations.
In short, the IDI accurately measures intercultural competence with results that are meaningful, useful, and practical. This tool is available in education and organization versions with professionally prepared customized results, including individual results, group and subgroup profiles, and customized intercultural development plans that provide a blueprint for developing cultural proficiency.
For those interested in using the IDI, we offer a qualifying seminar in the United States and internationally. We also offer a qualifying seminar as a...
Okay, let's go back here now. Okay, so there's your overview of the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is a great tool that really I've used broadly across the college, as well as I've used it privately in different organizations, and it's always had a very, very good, well-received result. Okay, so it's just really important to point out here that there's a wide range of uses of the IDI. You know, it can be developed for the development of intercultural competence, but just worth noting, the IDI is actually authorized use only. So you have to be a qualified administrator if you wish to introduce it into your organization. So let me just move my face out of here so we can see the slide. Okay, so how we view intercultural competence. So as you can see here, you get a bit of a snapshot of the differences across intercultural competence and what we mean by it. So we take a look first at the who, and then the what, and the how. So this can actually provide you with a nice little snapshot. So if you see on the left-hand side here, anytime we're talking about diversity, we're talking about the who that exists within an organization and that actual presence of differences. And you often see that organizations will represent this by, you know, how many staff do they have of different ethnic backgrounds? How many staff do they have people of color, for example? Then we move into specifically when we talk about intercultural competence and we're talking about what exactly is it? Well, it's essentially this idea that we want to leverage these differences between individuals to actually increase the opportunity for contributions from all staff within an organization. And we assess that by the outcomes, like what is the climate of our organization? How are people feeling? What kind of turnover do we have? Who's getting promoted, for example? When conflict arises, what is the conflict surrounding? And finally, then, if we want to get to this place where we want an organization where we have people that are interculturally competent, we have to look at how we're going to do that. So how do we achieve this sort of diversity, representation, and inclusion goals? And we do this by assessing using the IDI. Okay, so there's some important aspects of intercultural competence. And this is the idea that we can, shift cultural perspective and we can actually bridge our behavior to cultural commonality and difference. So first, like we need to have a deep cultural self-awareness, like who are we and how exactly do we see the world, which is part of what the IDI gives us. But then from there, we also need to have this cultural other awareness, which is this deep understanding of the experiences of people from different cultural communities. So in terms of someone's perceptions, in terms of their values, their beliefs, their behavior, and their practices. And then we have to behaviorally shift across these various cultural dimensions. So unlike other approaches, the IDI, it's important to emphasize that the IDI measures the actual mindset and skill set of how individuals and groups experience or how they make sense of or attach meaning to and behave in their interaction with cultural differences. And this is done by way of looking at the intercultural competence in terms of an intercultural development continuum, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But this assessment tool and model is holistic. It actually assesses mind and action sets, not individual personality. It's developmental, meaning, there's place to move. It doesn't typecast you. You're not stuck. You're going to move along the development continuum. And it's interculturally grounded. So it explains how individuals and group experience cultural difference and commonalities. And the IDI is different from other assessment tools. It's the only actually cross-culturally valid assessment of intercultural competence from a developmental perspective and model. So, and as a result of that, we can actually better target cross-cultural competence through training and coaching that takes the learning where the individual group is developmentally situated, and it takes you to a deeper understanding and a navigation of cultural differences. So it really is a good tool to actually move you forward. So here we go. So this is what is known as the intercultural development continuum. And essentially, this is how you are going to see yourself be sort of placed. So it moves what you can see at the bottom. It's this idea of, having sort of a monocultural mindset, moving all the way to what we consider an intercultural mindset. And just note that although, it's an arrow moving upward, this isn't meant to be, you're not trying to get, an A+ by being in adaptation per se. What you're trying to do is just sort of take a look at, where you're situated along the continuum and consider that in your day-to-day life. Like, am I in a denial mindset right now in my actions or my interactions at work? Am I in a polarization mindset? And I'll explain what those are. The idea is simply for us to be self-reflective and to figure out how to continue to move forward. So let's look first at denial. So when we say someone's in a denial mindset, essentially what we're saying is that that person might be missing difference. So they don't even notice, say, that there's any differences, and they might downplay it, that, it doesn't matter the difference between you and me. We can just all just move forward. We can be in denial about it. In terms of polarization, which kind of moves us along, this is a bit of a judgment of difference. So this is the idea that there's, kind of us and them. So this is the way we do things. This is the way they do things. And it kind of creates a bit of a polarization. It's sort of an us and them mindset. Next, we have minimization. And this is where, this is very common, particularly in Canada. We tend to be a bit of a minimization culture where we de-emphasize difference and we say, we're all the same, essentially. We're all human beings and we all care about each other. And can't we just, treat each other like human beings? And that's this idea of minimization. The challenge with that is it doesn't recognize the unique differences between people and the fact that people have actually very different lived experiences. And those impact their perceptions and the way that they interact in the world, which can be useful to learn from. Then we move into acceptance. Now, acceptance is a mindset where, you deeply comprehend difference. You can see clearly and recognize that there's differences cultural differences between people and you understand them at a deep level, and you bring them into your conversation, there's less of a fear that it's us and them. It's more of a genuine curiosity and interest. How are we different? I'm interested. Tell me more. And then the top of sort of this continuum is this idea of adaptation. So adaptation, and very few people actually are in this area. Adaptation is this idea that a person can deeply comprehend difference, and then they can just respond and adapt in any cultural situation with individuals in that culture. So it's just this sort of fluid movement between cultures with no sort of obvious difference in terms of their engagement. So we're not going to break into small groups in this activity, but we're just going to look more specifically at the videos and look at the orientations that there are. Okay, let's look here. Here we go. Oops. Sorry about that. Here we go.
Welcome to this presentation of the Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI.
Within this program, we will describe this tool and its practical applications as a panel of IDI qualified administrators share their real-world experiences with the inventory.
The current version of the IDI developed by Dr. Mitchell Hammer is a 50-item questionnaire that measures intercultural competence along the intercultural development continuum. This continuum, as described by IDI research, is based on validations and revisions of the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity originally proposed by Dr. Milton Bennett. Consider how you understand and behave toward people from other cultures who think and act differently from you. The IDI describes these ways of thinking, feeling, and responding to cultural differences in terms of 5 core intercultural competence mindsets and behaviors. These mindsets range from the monocultural perspectives of denial and polarization, the transitional mindset of minimization, and the intercultural or global mindsets of acceptance and adaptation.
Take a closer look at this continuum. What do you think your own primary orientation is? Research indicates you would probably not be very accurate. Does this surprise you? IDI results show that people typically overestimate their own intercultural competence. After all, it is a natural human tendency, again confirmed in research, to see ourselves as more capable than others may view us, or as more competent than we actually are. This tendency to overrate our own abilities can have positive effects. For instance, it can motivate us to reach for goals we might otherwise not try to achieve. However, when it comes to being interculturally effective, this can be a blind spot where we think we are more adaptable to cultural diversity than we actually are. The IDI allows individuals and organizations to overcome this blind spot, allowing targeted development of intercultural competence that otherwise would not be effectively achieved.
Extensive validation studies confirm the IDI is a rigorous, cross-culturally generalizable, valid, and reliable assessment.
Okay, let's just move this a little further ahead where we can get into the actual differences. Here, let's see here.
Chinese individual was not individuals can feel unsupported and ignored.
Sorry about that. Let me just back this up a little bit more here. Okay.
And an organizational version, with results professionally prepared.
Orientation often reflects limited experiences.
intercultural competencies. The IDI is translated into many languages and can be used for baseline assessments, team building, and individual coaching and development.
Now let's take a closer look at each of the 5 intercultural mindsets and behaviors. We'll begin with the monocultural mindset, starting with denial. Denial sees more observable differences, but may not fully recognize deeper cultural patterns, for instance, in conflict resolution styles. This mindset may also avoid or withdraw from interaction with people from different cultures. A denial orientation often reflects limited experiences living in other countries and sees the importance for newly hired diverse members to fit into the organization. However, denial may not equally value diverse approaches that are not as familiar. As a result, diverse individuals can feel unsupported and ignored. A key developmental step is to focus conscious attention and learning on observing cultural differences that may be escaping notice. We invited a group of professional IDI qualified administrators to discuss their experiences working with individuals whose profiles revealed various mindsets. Let's listen to the experience of someone who has a denial orientation.
Robert works for a major law firm. He is their business manager, and he's been with them now for 25 years. His developmental orientation is in denial. Denial for Robert, let's have an example of a meeting where things really went off the rails. Okay, and he was running this meeting, and one of the gentlemen in the group was from an Eastern culture. I believe this was a Chinese individual. And the Chinese individual was not making eye contact with him, and Robert got very upset about this and actually pointed it out to the individual in front of the group that he's not making eye contact, that he should be making eye contact, and he was showing no respect. And talking to Robert about that it's an interesting discussion, because Robert doesn't think we should be going to culture. Culture shouldn't have anything to do with this. This is still about respect. When his boss wanted to talk to him about some of the situations that were going wrong, and it had to do a lot with this initiative they're doing. You know, Robert, we're doing this initiative because we need to become much more interculturally competent. And Robert insisted that he was wrong, that this was about respect. And it put Robert in a very bad position there for a while. This is where it was taking him, this attitude of not wanting to deal with cultural differences.
Polarization sees cultural differences from a more judgmental viewpoint that can take the form of us versus them. One form of polarization is defense, an uncriticalness toward one's own cultural values and practices, and an overly critical view toward other cultural practices. Cultural difference is seen as an obstacle to overcome, divisive, and perhaps threatening. Further, someone with a defense orientation may feel under siege from diversity. Others can perceive this mindset as a sense of superiority towards the values and practices of culturally different groups. This can happen because of an overemphasis on negative differences toward other groups and less attention on the commonalities that exist across cultures. In organizations, defense may support training efforts for diverse talent to learn how things are done here, without equal support of how different experiences and skills can be better included in the organization. Another form of polarization is reversal. Reversal is an overly critical view toward one's own group and an uncritical view toward the practices of other communities. This can lead to an idealization of some cultures and their way of life. This mindset also takes on an us versus them view, but in this case, other groups are the good guys and my culture is the bad guy. Reversal can also actively support the cause of an underrepresented group. However, this is done with little deeper understanding of what the other group's cause means to members of that group. When polarization is present in a group, diversity often feels uncomfortable and may experience a sense of bias with their contributions unrecognized. Here is an interview about someone who views cultural differences from a defense orientation.
Marisol is from Spain, and Marisol was born and raised in eastern Spain, in a large city in eastern Spain. She was raised, and these are her words, in a very traditional Spanish family. She was raised with 3 brothers, and she describes her father as patriarchal. Marisol is at polarization. That takes the form of defense as measured by the Intercultural Development Inventory. This basic orientation that she has is not helpful to the U.S. students that she's working with. She regards the behavior of young U.S. women who are studying abroad as scandalous. She says that they are making themselves to be sex objects, that they dress inappropriately, that they share information inappropriately on their Facebook pages. She's frankly appalled at their behavior. She doesn't understand why the students won't embrace, to use her word, some of the traditions of Spanish culture. For example, she herself is an aficionada of the bullfights. And while she acknowledges that there are people who don't like bullfights, she cannot understand that there are students who simply will not go to a bullfight. That what she's doing is she's polarizing tremendously. She polarizes anything that the students do that reminds her of the issues that she had trouble with in the United States, which are consumerism, U.S. foreign policy, the fact that after 6 p.m. she says nobody is on the streets, the fact that U.S. Americans are boring in conversation, that the U.S. students are not engaged enough, that they don't know anything about Spanish culture, that they can't speak intelligently with their host families, and on and on and on. The issue really is her affect, which is profoundly polarizing. The world consists of them and us, and she's in an embattled situation.
Now let's look at an interview with someone who operates from a reversal orientation.
John is a very senior level person in a financial services organization. His orientation on the IDI is polarization in the form of reversal. He highlighted for me that he served on a number of boards that were primarily advocacy organizations for people of color, and that he served as a sponsor for some of the employee network groups, and that he was a champion for diversity and inclusion. He was very intolerant of anybody who, quote, didn't get it. And so if they didn't get it, they were wrong, they were jerks. And so rather than, he was such a strong advocate for, this is the right way to go, and, diversity is the right way to go, and everybody needs to understand that this is what we need to do. But he wasn't inclusive of those people who perhaps, for whatever reason, didn't agree with him or didn't get it. So he was advocating for, quote, the underrepresented, the underdog, if you will. And that's where his reversal came in, because he had, in a very absolute way, taken on the cause of these other groups.
Minimization is a transitional mindset in between monocultural and intercultural mindsets. It is an orientation that highlights cultural commonalities across diverse groups. However, this can mask deeper recognition and understanding of cultural differences. Minimization can be effective across cultures when commonalities are useful to the task at hand and adapting to difference is not required. However, this orientation struggles when common policies are not sufficient for bridging across diverse groups. When this happens, minimization is challenged to more deeply understand other cultural perspectives and engage in adaptive behavior. For dominant group members, minimization tends to lack deeper cultural self-awareness, including awareness around power and privilege. For non-dominant group members, minimization is often more of a strategy to adjust to the dominant culture's values and practices. For example, a go-along to get along strategy. The strength of this perspective is its focus on the elimination of bias, prejudice, and discrimination. This is done by establishing common policies and practices that help assure equal opportunity for all. While these efforts clearly improve cross-cultural relations, they do not address how to adapt to diverse perspectives or behaviors. As a result, diverse perspectives and experiences are typically not fully heard. Here is an interview concerning someone with a minimization, dominant culture orientation.
Suzanne works for a community health center. She is a social worker. Suzanne has is the minimization from a dominant culture perspective. How she deals with other cultures, and she feels that she's very intercultural. Because her quote to me was, I deal with cultures all the time. Of course I'm intercultural. But what I hear from Suzanne is that she's dealing with those other cultures from a perspective of her own, that she's not questioning the culture themselves. She's just helping that person or those people from that culture. One of the other things about Suzanne is that, she's really good at looking at how abuse is happening across the cultures. That's one of her strengths, that abuse is a commonality across cultures. Where her effectiveness is impacted is when she's not considering some of the cultural nuances or some of the differences as how people look at these different aspects of what a divorce does, or what's happening with abuse, or what's happening in that culture.
Now let's hear about someone who views cultural differences from a minimization, non-dominant orientation.
Doug is an African-American male, probably early 40s. He's worked for one organization in his entire career. It's a major insurance company. Doug is a non-dominant group person, and he frames his world minimization from that perspective. And what I mean by that is when I revealed to Doug that minimization was his primary orientation, and I explained to him what that meant, his answer to me, and I'll almost never forget this because it was just so compelling, his answer was, "You're daggone right, I'm in minimization, and that's exactly where I want to be. That's exactly where I'm going to stay." He said, "I'm a big black guy." He said, "When I come in the room, everybody can see that I'm different." He said, "I don't want them to see that I am different." He said, "I want them to see me as the same as them. I don't want to be threatening in any way, and this works for me." He said, "This is probably one of the reasons that I got to where I am. I put people at ease by focusing on the similarities, and I don't talk about my differences." Doug and I discussed the other side of this and some of the downside, if you will, of the worldview orientation of minimization. And I said to him, might there be times when you might have a different idea about how to approach something that you may not bring up because you don't, again, want to highlight your differences? Perhaps the majority in the room in a meeting want to go in one direction, and you're thinking, there may be a different way to approach this, but perhaps you don't bring it up. And he said, "You're right." He said that does happen. He said, I pretty much, go along to get along. He recognizes that this probably is limiting him from bringing his entire contribution to the organization. He recognizes that he's probably not as creative and innovative as he might be. He might, with other people in his team, he might also not be recognizing some of the differences that they bring. That he supports a conformity worldview with the team that he leads. And so he really wants everybody to be on the same page. He said his language, we all have to be on the same page. Let's march forward. We're all together in this. We're all the same. And so he did indicate that he does lead that way. He wants people to conform.
Let's review the intercultural or global mindsets of the IDI continuum. Acceptance recognizes and appreciates cultural differences and commonalities. However, acceptance is challenged to appropriately adapt to difference. In the workplace, acceptance is often a strong advocate for deeper understanding and developing more effective, culturally responsive practices. However, what those practices are is difficult to identify and harder still to act in appropriately adaptive ways. The result is that diversity may feel understood, but not fully engaged. Here's an interview about someone who views cultural differences from an acceptance orientation.
Nancy is a white woman, probably in her mid-50s. She's a senior HR leader in the organization. She did have assignments, short-term assignments, not long-term assignments, 3 to 6 month kinds of assignments outside the United States, and her primary orientation is acceptance. when people would come to her for advice, other people would say, well, this person is not performing well. She knew the right kinds of questions to ask, to say, is this really a performance issue, or have you thought about this, or perhaps there's something else going on that might be culturally related. So she was really good at pulling that out and helping people to reframe what a problem might be. Said, oh, this really isn't a performance issue. There is something else going on here. So she was great at asking the questions. She was great at helping people to push other people who might be, at minimization or some other point along the continuum. But Nancy didn't have a clue when it came to what to really do about those differences. So we talked about that, and I asked her how she did that, how she was navigating the differences. And she said that, well, she made lots of presentations to the senior leaders, and pretty much she was putting the onus on the senior leaders to do something about it. I asked her why she felt the leaders were responsible for coming up with the solutions. And she said, well, they're the leaders, they're above me. That's their role in the organization. I then probed as to whether she felt that the leaders were culturally competent enough to actually come up with some of those adaptive solutions. And she thought, she said, I never thought about that.
Finally, we come to the global mindset of adaptation. Adaptation is able to shift perspective and change behavior in culturally appropriate ways. Individuals typically have substantial experience with diversity and have internalized a rich repertoire of behaviors that effectively bridge across cultural differences. People within adaptation often see their role as demanding high levels of intercultural competence, what we might call performance and adaptation. Further, domestic and international differences are used as a resource in multicultural teams and within the organization as a whole. The result is that diversity feels valued, involved, and engaged in the mission and work of the organization or educational institution. Here is an interview about someone who views cultural differences from an adaptation orientation.
Catherine is a teacher and educator in Beijing, China. Catherine is at adaptation on the IDI. She was born and raised in Southern California. Her father is Chinese American from an immigrant family. In so many ways, she is a person who adapts very readily. She's very, very good at crossing cultures. She recognizes the complexity of issues. She's not judgmental about them. And in her own life, she switches back and forth between cultures very, very readily. Catherine has the ability to adapt so fluidly to Chinese culture. On a visit to Beijing a couple of years ago, I saw this in a lot of ways. Here's a good example. One morning, Catherine came by. She and I were going to be in meetings all day. And she came by my hotel, and rather than going to breakfast, she said, let's go to this park. And so we went into the park, and a lot of people were doing collective exercises, like Tai Chi. And I noticed, and I've seen this a lot in China, but I had never really thought about the fact that this is oftentimes older people who are doing this. And just about everybody there in the park who was doing this were older, 60s, 70s. And I asked her about that. I said, well, why is that? And she said, I've never really thought about that. And so she approached the group, and I thought what she would do is, I thought she would ask somebody in the group. I don't speak Mandarin. She does fluently. But she didn't. She went up to the group, and she fell into line, and she began to do Tai Chi very slowly, in the motions. No one was surprised. I didn't know if an individual could just join a group like that, or if this is a group that's together all the time. And no one reacted as if that was anything amiss. And she did this for quite a long time. And I stood off to the side because I don't do this. I don't know how to do it. But I was fascinated simply watching her do this, watching her get into the flow of that culture. She dances in China like the Chinese dance. And at the end, when the group stopped, then she turned to some people and she began discussing this with people. And then she came over to me. She switched back in and she said, this is what I have found out. I have found out that at this time of the morning, that in fact, the people who primarily do this are older people. People have different opinions why that might be. Later in the day, there are younger people, but the older people might be there simply because they don't sleep so well. They're up at dawn, and so they go and they get together. This is something they can do together. Again, she dances in China like the Chinese dance.
Here's another interview about someone who views cultural differences from an adaptation mindset.
Cynthia is a partner for a huge consulting firm in Europe. She's 47 years old. She's been a partner with them now for 5 years. She is Scottish, brought up in Scotland in a monocultural home. She has now lived in Germany working for this organization for 10 years. She is in adaptation. This is her primary orientation on the developmental continuum of the IDI. What was interesting was that when I was talking with Cynthia was that she gets very impatient at times. And she doesn't quite understand why we aren't getting it here, okay? And this brought up a really interesting discussion for us because what we have found through our work with the IDI, that this is a challenge for people in adaptation. That sometimes we find that they want people to be where they are very quickly. And I teach you this and now you should just have it. Cynthia was telling me about another situation that came up for her when she was dealing with two different organizations that were coming together in a merger and acquisition type situation. And this was a German company that was now going to be acquiring a company from the Far East. And some of the problems that they started to have when it came to how they were presenting in particular contracts and just the communication around that. Cynthia was really able, she was very good at finding some of these mutually adaptive solutions that helped them bridge from the German perspective to the Chinese perspective, which is what where the organization was located, and how she knew that you had to handle contracts differently. She knew that the communication style was very different from direct to indirect communication style. So she was really, really quite perceptive and really good at finding those solutions that really help bridge this merger and acquisition so much better.
Okay, so that's a good look at the different profiles along the continuum. And now I'm sure what you're most interested in finding out is how did we perform as a group? Or how did you perform? I wasn't tested in this one. So let's take a look at the group results and see how the group fell. So I'm going to pull them up and you'll see me walk through the different areas. So let me just see here 1 second. Stop sharing for a moment. Mm-hmm. Let me see here. Okay, so hopefully you can see this good now. So let's take a look at sort of what you will get when you get a group report. It'll look very similar if you request your individual report from me. So let's take a look here. So it gives you a little bit of background in the start of it. It's a reminder of the continuum as you see it, from denial to adaptation. And here's just an overall description of those different orientations as well that you can use to remind yourself. So there's going to be some different areas in the group profile that I'm going to show to you to help you understand sort of the differences and the things that we report on. So the first thing that you'll see, and you see here, is what's known as the perceived orientation. And this orientation is simply telling us where does the group think they're at. So how do we think we're doing as individuals in terms of intercultural competence? And here you can see the group thinks that we're somewhere in acceptance. And this is pretty common. We like to think we're accepting individuals. Acceptance sounds nice. And we think that, of course, we embrace and welcome other cultures. So here you can see as a group, the group is sort of middle of the road in acceptance. They got a score of 119.70. So that's our perceived orientation. Now, as you can imagine, what I'm going to show you is we're actually going to be always a bit lower than our perception. Usually we don't know exactly where our areas of improvement are, or areas of orientation are. So let's take a look at where this group actually is. So this group actually is right here in between sort of polarization and minimization. And like I mentioned previously, this can be really common. Sometimes it can be common with, when we go into a new environment. So say if you're a student who's an international student, a lot of times when you come into a new country or you enter into a new culture, there's more of an awareness of difference and sort of, oh, I do it this way, they do it this way. You can have that kind of immediate sort of response, that immediate orientation when you go to work or live or perform in a new country. So here you see our gap here. So we have a pretty great big gap in this group. So this is the difference between how we perceive ourselves and how we actually are is, around 29 points. So that means we pretty much overestimate where we're at right now. And that's normal. We pretty see that across the board. So you can look that over if you look at your individual results, and it's okay to overestimate. But let's look specifically at where this group is in terms of minimization. So like I was mentioning, minimization, it can be used, it could be a coping strategy if say you're a person who's a non-dominant member of the culture. So you kind of just, try to notice the difference so that you can actually later figure out how to navigate the systems in a particular way. But what's great about minimization is it doesn't view any differences as a threat to their own cultural practices. It just sees the difference, but it's not concerned. It's not like polarization where it's like, oh no, I don't want to do things the way the other side of the group does it. And what's nice about minimization, again, it avoids stereotyping. So it's like, we're all the same, we're all humans. We try to find the commonalities. We want to see ourselves the same. And we're interested in the difference, but we just can't really necessarily adapt to other cultural practices right now. And one thing to notice about this is that sometimes we will have responded in the IDI and we're kind of thinking about a particular context in our life. So for example, like you might be looking at it sort of as a male-female construct. And if you were looking at the difference between men and women, you might be lower or higher on the continuum based on if you were looking at something across race. So there's a lot of context involved here. But sometimes with minimization, what can happen is one does not necessarily identify how they actually see the world. So sometimes we're so conditioned in our lifestyle, or we've lived maybe in a small community our entire life, and we don't actually realize that the way that we see the world is very unique and individual. We can sometimes think everyone does see things the way that we do. But in fact, that's just sort of just a lack of awareness around how maybe our environment has sort of impacted our view on the world. So again, so there's this assumption that people are just like us. And that's, really good, nothing wrong with that. So our strength is that, we can work really well with other cultures when we can find these commonalities. But in terms of our development, we might struggle in terms of trying to bridge across diverse communities, and that's where we want to work towards. Okay, so in this group, you can see that there was a large number of this group that was in minimization, and then there was a few of us that were in polarization and some in denial. And that's all fine. It just makes our group really unique and some areas to explore. What's good is that we're continuing to grow and we're leading in a particular way. We're leading towards minimization, and ours are acceptance through adaptation, which is a good forward motion. And I'll share this with you as well. I'll make sure that you get a copy of this IDI group profile. So that it just kind of talks about the demographics of this group for our own interest's sake. Let's just switch back. Okay, let me see here. Okay, so that was our group results. And like I mentioned, if you'd like to see your individual results, you can send me an email. It's Michelle, M-I-C-H-E-L-L-E mohawk.turan, Turan, at mohawkcollege.ca, and I'll send you your individual results. And if you'd like to discuss them further, we can have a one-to-one meeting. So the next steps is, just to really get a good idea of, the intercultural competencies. One of the things you get when you get your intercultural development inventory, your own assessment, is we actually give you an IDP, which is a plan that gives you a customized developmental blueprint to maybe grow or move along the continuum. So that's something you might enjoy having a look at. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the opportunity for Q&A with your faculty member, and she can share any questions with me, or you can email me directly. I'm happy to participate in a discussion board or any of those things. But just in terms of getting us to wrap up just on time, thank you for listening, and I hope this was enjoyable to you. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me by email. I'd be happy to discuss this further by phone, by Zoom, or by email. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day. I really wish I could have met y'all in person, but that's where we're at right now. Thanks, and have a wonderful day. Enjoy the sunshine.